Chapter 16 of The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds by John Luther Langworthy. Chapter 16. The Chief Meets an Old Friend. There was a tremendous amount of excitement in the workshop when Frank aroused his four chums by this cry. All around him he could hear them calling out. "Another fake alarm, I bet," grumbled Larry. "It's that miserable elephant again," said Andy in disgust. "He ought to be taken down to the lake and ducked, that's what." "Me ducked? I'd like to see you do it," shrilled a voice close beside Andy, and which he recognized as belonging to the runt. "Hey, Frank, what is it?" demanded Larry. "Light up. We want to see something," called Andy, now beginning to experience a strange sensation in the region of his heart as the possibility of its being the genuine article of alarm struck home. Frank was already doing this very same thing. He struck his match even while Andy was calling so loudly for a light. When the lamp was brought into use, the boys stared around at each other. "Where's Stuttering Nat?" questioned Larry suspiciously. "Here," came a quavering voice, as the other pushed himself forward, so that none of them would believe he might be at fault, as he was not particularly desirous of a bath just then. "Then we're all on deck, ain't that so, Frank?" asked Andy. "Count noses and you'll find it that way," returned the other bird boy, as he calmly picked up his gun. "Take the lamp, Andy, and fall in just behind me," he said. "Oh, Frank believes he's caught him," gasped Elephant in a quivering voice. "Stop talking and come on, everybody," Frank insisted. Each boy had armed himself as best the occasion allowed. One carried a hammer, another a baseball bat, while Elephant had found his club, and Larry picked up a 7-foot piece of piping, which he thrust ahead of him after the nature of a spear. So they advanced in the direction of the end of the shed where Frank had arranged his trap. Every one of them felt his heart beating like a trip hammer as the sound of writhing accompanied by groans came to their ears. There seemed no reason to longer doubt but what the trap would be found sprung and game of some species within. "Hold up that lamp, Andy," said Frank sternly. "Here, don't let your hands tremble so. We must have light, you know. Steady now." "Oh, I see him," gasped Elephant, whose eyes were almost sticking out of his head with the excitement. "I guess it's Jules, all right," Andy managed to say as he too took a long breath, while he thrust the lamp out further so that all could see better. Something lay in the hole, something that took on the outlines of a man flat on his face and with a heavy log almost squeezing the last bit of breath from his body. A broken old gun that looked like one of the muskets used in the Civil War lay close beside him and had evidently been dropped when the trap was sprung without warning, after the victim had started to crawl into the shed by way of this inviting opening. "Yes, it's our old friend Jules come to pay us another night visit," observed Frank, coolly as he handed the shotgun to Larry, and bending down proceeded to draw both arms of the senseless man behind him, fastening them securely with a stout cord which he drew from his pocket, having prepared for this same event in advance. "Is he killed?" asked Elephant in an awestruck voice. "Sure he isn't," replied Larry, who had seen the man moving, as though his senses might be coming back. 5 minutes later he opened his eyes and stared hard at the array of boyish faces before him. Evidently Jules may have suspected that the bird boys would be sleeping in their precious shop, but he had hardly imagined that he would run up against a whole school there. Frank had meanwhile tied his ankles as well, and helped drag him further into the shop. When the man started to using language that was offensive, he warned him plainly that if he kept that up any longer they would find some means of gagging him. The threat served to keep him quiet, though from the black looks on his face it was evident that the fellow was extremely bitter against them all. It was now 3 o'clock. Since all of them were too much excited to even try to sleep any more, they concluded to remain on guard in a bunch. Larry received no end of joshing on account of having slept on his post. Frank even told him that it was considered so serious a matter that men had been stood up against a wall and shot for allowing the enemy to creep into camp. "All right," said Larry, who hung on to the gun all the while. "Let's see you do it right now. I'm the only one that's got a shooting iron, and I refuse to give it up or use it on myself." "Call it off, Frank, and we'll begin all over." And so, as Larry was a pretty decent sort of fellow as they go, and besides, just as he said, held possession of the only weapon, For that musket had been broken by the fall of the log, they concluded not to shoot him on the spot, but give him another chance to make good. It was a long wait till morning, but finally the stars vanished before the gray light of early dawn. Larry, as soon as he could see decently, started to get breakfast, for he declared that if he was a mighty poor sentry, he did have a few good points, one of which was his ability to sling tasty messes together. Jules was as mum as a church mouse, as Elephant called it, but by degrees he took more or less interest in what the boys were doing. "Look out for him," said Larry aside to Frank. "I think he means to try and escape if he gets half a chance. That's why he smiles now and then." "You're way off, Larry," replied Frank, "for I notice that every time that pleasant look creeps over his face, it is when a smell of coffee drifts this way. Jules hasn't tasted anything like that for more than a year. And while he's got to go back to where the law has sent him, we're going to give him a decent breakfast first." When a little later they heard the stamp of the colonel's crutch, the boys looked up expectantly, knowing they would have the laugh on the old veteran traveler who had flown to the rescue when the alarm was all a farce and slept through the real thing. "What's all this? Bless me if they haven't caught the rascal after all. Why didn't you ring me up? That alarm bell must have played me false, Andy, and I believe you juggled with it. The old cry of wolf again, and I'm the victim." Expressing his disgust in this way, the colonel stumped in and proceeded to let the prisoner know what he thought of a man who would try to revenge himself upon a couple of bright lads, especially after bringing all his troubles down upon his own shoulders. It afterwards developed that Jules had stolen the musket, and also the suit of clothes he was wearing, from a farmhouse that he raided shortly after his escape from the prison. Although he never confessed to the fact, Frank never had any reason to doubt but that it had been Jules who fired that shot at them while they were speeding over the Powell woods in their biplane. Jules was given his fill of good breakfast, and this possibly put him in a better humor. He was not wholly an unscrupulous villain, and the fact of these boys treating him so decently seemed to make an impression on the fellow, for he watched Frank closely. The boys were talking the matter over as to how they might best get their prisoner transported to the lockup in town when sharp-eyed Nat began to make a great noise and pointed down the road. "It must be the chief and his officers heading back home," cried Andy, jumping up from his seat. "Here, make a dash toward the fence and get their attention. Don't tell them why we want them to come in here, but just let down the bars," said Frank, and at his words Andy went flying away across the pasture. By swinging his arms and shouting, he managed to attract the attention of those in the passing car, which was halted. Then Frank saw Andy speaking hastily, at the same time letting down the bars, after which the car swung in, with the bird boy perched on the step. Chief Waller did not look particularly happy, as he sat there alongside the man who served as chauffeur. He had lost a night's sleep, and covered many miles in a useless search of the great Powell woods, and for so stout a man this was exhausting business. "Hello, Frank. How are you, Colonel? Sorry to say we haven't picked up our man yet, and the chances are we won't do it either. He must have taken the alarm and slipped off before we got there." Then the police head must have detected Elephant grinning broadly, and this no doubt excited his suspicions, for he whirled on Frank, having laboriously descended from his car, and burst out with, "Looky here, Frank. What have you got up your sleeve, anyhow? There's something doing that I ought to know about, I reckon." "Oh, we thought it might pay us to set a trap, Chief," returned Frank, keeping as straight a face as possible. "Sometimes you have to go to the mountain, and then again it comes to you. We made up our minds to try it anyhow." "And it worked?" demanded Chief Waller, his face lighting up with eagerness. "Did it, fellows?" asked Frank, turning to the rest of his mates. "If the chief had been anywhere around at 3 this morning, he'd have thought something was working all right," gurgled Andy, his face all aglow. "Larry, help our guest out here, won't you?" said Frank, and only too willing, the one addressed stepped inside the shop, to reappear a moment later and not alone. Chief Waller took but one look and then threw up his hands, exclaiming, "Jules Garone, and nabbed by a parcel of boys. Man, the joke is on us." End of chapter 16.